Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Misfit History. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host Hannah and our special guest and always producer, Joey. Today we'll be talking about Hedy Lamarr, who was not that famous for a while, but has really come into a lot more prominence lately. She was the Hollywood star who now is considered the mother of Wi-Fi. She was an innovator, a brilliant individual despite not having a ton of formal education, and an actress who is dubbed the most beautiful woman in the world. So she has a lot of crazy stories. She should be a pretty interesting story. Hedy Lamarr was not born Hedy Lamarr. She was born Hedwig Kiesler in Vienna on November 9th, 1914, to an assimilated Jewish family. Now, Vienna, where she was born in the 1920s, was defined by Red Vienna, which was social democratic rule, marked by radical social housing, welfare reforms, and it was a period that was marred by the post-World War I hardship that we discussed previously in other episodes. Just basically the fallout from World War I really tore at Austria, Hungary, Germany, and similar countries because they had to pay all of the war debts. Now, because of its social democratic leadership, Vienna in particular was a major hub for artists, writers, thinkers, scientists. It was called the Center of Fermentation, and we had a lot of different unique voices in postmodern art, and a lot of experimental thinking was there. Sigmund Freud, who was the psychoanalyst who has some very strange ideas, but like the 1950s laying on a couch and getting psychoanalyzed, that was Sigmund Freud. Earlier was pioneering a lot of that. There was something called coffee shop discussions, which was where musicians or artists would gather and talk about the world and talk about politics and the directions of art. And Hedwig would have been heavily influenced by this spot she grew up in. She would have seen that Vienna in particular had a lot of women getting involved in science and art beyond what most of the world was at, because they were a very liberal, free thinking area, very progressive, and they were kind of expanding societal roles for all people. Part of that was also because of all of the people who died during World War I, all the young men who died. They needed jobs replaced, and that it's similar to what happened in America during World War II, when all the factories began getting worked, and then there was some rebound on the nuclear family after a couple of years when it returned, because people were like, hey, I already know how to do this too. So there was a story about Hedwig from when she was young. She was always interested in innovation, and when she was 5 years old, she received a music box from her parents, and she took apart the music box and rebuilt it while only 5 years old. And her father, who was a banker, was a very smart individual. He was well educated in engineering, especially civil engineering. And they would walk around and he would discuss how bridges were constructed. He would discuss buildings and safety equipment and trams. 1920s, Vienna had a ton of public transportation, which is also part of why it flourished for its artistic stuff. And they would discuss how modern trams worked. So from a very young age, she was able to, grow her innovative mind for thinking, even without a formal scientific education. She was constantly looking at inventive science, and in a capital of the world in innovative thinking and mixing art and science, which becomes important later because she doesn't have a formal scientific background. Now, she was interested in photography early. She was considered extremely beautiful even when she was a young age. And by the time she was an early teenager, she would walk into a room and conversations would stop. It was unbelievable the draw she had on people. And she won a beauty contest across the entire country at age 12. So she began calling herself Hedy, shortened from Hedwig. And when she was 16, she would just walk into photographer shops and tell them to photograph her. And she was pretty enough that they wouldn't charge her. And she was 16 years old. She walked into the largest film production studio in the country and said that they should give her a role. So she was very much taking life by the horns. And she walked in and said, I should be in a movie. And director Max Reinhardt discovered her and decided to put her in some small appearing roles while she was still underage. And her first role was a minor one in 1930s Money on the Street, which is what its English name is. I don't know what it was called in Austria. I do, but I can't read it. So it was awkward. She was on screen, but you could tell she enjoyed being on screen. Like, it's a very vibrant thing. But 3 years later, as in 17 and 18-year-old, her film Ecstasy was released, and it was extremely controversial, to say the least. In it was the first naked appearance of someone in a film, major motion picture, as well as several other incidents. It was a romance story about a woman who falls in love with. It's not important to go into the story. You can watch the movie probably for free. It's because it's from the 1930s. But the controversy that spilled out from this story was so extreme that Pope Pius XI denounced the film. In the official Vatican newspaper, the film was denounced. Adolf Hitler banned it, which part of that was because she was technically Jewish. But it was also in part because of the content. And it was the first film that the U.S. Customs Service ever banned for being obscene and immoral. So this was like a film that had a lot of firsts. And when someone tried to import a print of the film, it was seized and burned by the custom agents. So she rose to international superstardom, though, because she was, as you can see on the poster, the featured actress in the most controversial film in the world in the early 1930s. So this film was the starting point for her superstardom, and she began to get noticed. She was noticed in particular by Fritz Mandl, who was an Austrian munitions magnate. He was one of the most wealthy and powerful industrialists in all of Austria. He inherited and expanded Hartenberger Patronenfabrik, a major arms manufacturer that sold weapons and ammunition across Europe. He would move through political circles and did business with many authoritarian regimes, including fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini and Nazi Germany, despite being born Jewish. But they paid well. And he was an arms dealer, which means his number one goal in life was making money. But his number two goal in life was status. He was obsessed with being having a high status, and he wanted a trophy wife. And Hedy Lamarr, who was more than 10 years younger than him and only 18 at the time, needed stability. This was someone who was like very publicly famous for how influential and powerful he was. He wound up holding several political offices in Austria. So he appeared as kind of a protector, patron type of, this is a really good deal for her. And so he saw her in a play called Sissy that she was in, starring in, and he was obsessed with her, and they got married in 1933, the same year Ecstasy came out. Now, what she didn't realize was he was so obsessed with power that he was micromanaging and very, very controlling. And he was so angered by the film Ecstasy that he spent roughly $280,000, which is more than $5 million in today's money, attempting to buy up and destroy every single copy. Unfortunately for him, every time he bought a copy, they made new ones because he didn't buy the rights to the film. So he just made the film manufacturer so much money. But he had been a soldier in World War I before learning chemistry. That's what his education was in. And so Hedy probably picked up a lot of chemistry from discussions with him she said later in life, and has some of the inventions to back it up, that she was very good at chemistry. She said during some interviews. But the main thing that she would have learned with him is she had to sit at dinner with him. And he would have dinner with scientists, weapons manufacturers, engineers, and war commanders. And they would discuss problems they had with weaponry, solutions they needed, battlefield issues that, we need something that can deal with different climates. We need stuff for various reasons. And although this was very boring because she wasn't allowed to talk at these meetings, she was able to learn a lot about weapons design and practical implementation of innovation of weapons. But she said of Mandel, this is what she said in one of her books later: "I knew very soon that I could never be an actress while I was his wife. He was the absolute monarch in his marriage. I was like a doll. I was a thing, some object of art which had to be guarded and imprisoned, having no mind, no life of its own." So that statement, plus the Anschluss pressure, which was the ongoing pressure that Germany was exerting on Austria to move toward Nazism. A lot of Nazis began getting pushed into power, which made things more and more uncomfortable for Jewish people. And because she was considered Jewish, even though she was raised Christian, her family was ethnically Jewish, led to her escape. So he wouldn't let her leave, though. What? He wouldn't let her leave their house. But she was allowed to have a say in who they hired at their staff. And obviously, if he spent $5 million modern day dollars just on buying copies of a single video, he was wealthy. Yeah. They had a lot of staff. They had meetings again with dictators and everyone you can imagine. And so she had to be creative on how she could escape. So one of the maids she hired had a similar profile to her. And then Hedy took some sleeping powder and mixed it into a cup of tea. And then while her maid was drinking tea, Hedy swapped the tea cups. The maid fell asleep, and Hedy swapped the maid's clothes with her own, and then sewed to the inside of the maid's outfit all her jewelry, hopped on her bike dressed as the maid, leaving the maid to look like it was Hedy having fallen asleep in the middle of a room, and rode her bike out of their house.
So like he wouldn't let her leave at all?
Yes, he was hyper controlling.
Like just not even.
Yeah, her job was to be at the house. And not like in a keep the house. It was just be around so that he could show people he was married to the most controversial actress in Austria at the time. But she wound up getting into London and realized she had absolutely no prospects. She was selling her jewelry to stay afloat. And then she was told by an agent, a talent agent, there was a little man in a hotel she should go see. And she went to see this little man, and that little man turned out to be Louis B. Mayer. That is mayor of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM Studios, the lion roaring.
Oh, wow.
One of the biggest production studios in the world. So that was Louis B. Mayer of famed MGM Studios. And Louis said that he wanted to hire her as an actress. Well, second he took a look at her. To be fair, because it kind of sounds like she was just that beautiful. She was just that beautiful. Like this wound up happening quite a bit. But in this particular instance, the reason he was in London was he was trying to get all of the German, Austrian, and Hungarian actors who were fleeing the Nazi regime to sign on with MGM for exclusive contracts so that he could take and start producing German films outside of the Nazi regime using all their big superstars who were desperate for a job because the German movie making apparatus. Germany was at that point only making propaganda films. So Goebbels, the head of propaganda, and there were quite a few other people that were producing films, but they all had to be approved by the Nazis. So working actors in the Nazi Empire at that point all had to be approved. And so a lot of Jewish actors wouldn't be. A lot of, people who were not considered Aryan wouldn't be allowed to act in films. So he wanted her right away, and he said he'd pay her $125 a week. And she said, no, and refused him despite needing desperately needing the money. And so when he booked his passage back to America, she booked a passage on the same ship as him, the SS Normandy. And then she would make sure that anytime he was on deck, she would be on deck as well. And the actors who were with him, she would chat to them. And then in the dining hall, she came in dressed in her only like evening gown that she had saved. She dressed to the nines, put on all the jewelry she hadn't sold yet, and walked into the dining hall, and everyone turned and looked at her. And then when she walked past Louis B. Mayer's table, he called her over and offered her $500 a week to appear in one of his movies. And she said, sure. So she went from 125 to 500 on the spot.
I mean, that's smart.
It's big time smart, but it's risky because imagine if he's like,
he's
like,
you're not
no.
getting into movies. And now she's just on the run from an arms dealer.
Yeah. So what did he try to come get her?
He wound up marrying 4 other people through.
So she left, and
he just was like, you know
He
what?
just didn't care at all.
I don't know. I'm sure he was a little ego hurting for a while.
Yeah.
Definitely this guy had a big ego. He was one of the people who wound up in South America at the end of the war, which for those who don't know, South America was a hiding spot for a lot of war criminals. Now, whether he was technically a war criminal is a little more controversial. He wasn't an obvious one the way some people who wound up hiding in South America were. But it is very coincidental that he had bigger problems. She fled in 1937. World War II was getting underway right about then. Over the next 2 years, Austria was involved in several major wars. So.
Also, he had enough money that like he could have been like just like hired one person to be like, you need to go track her down.
Yeah. At a certain point, though, it's like also anyone he hired probably would have a tough time getting into the U.S. This is some Austrian is showing up who's a, former military or whatever would have had the repertoire to chase her down in the middle of World War II. They're like, yeah, no, you're not coming in. So while she was there, though, they had the same problem I had, which was, what was her name? Was it Hedy Kiesler? Was it Hedwig Kiesler? Was it Hedy Kiesler? And so they said, we need to give you a new name. And Louis B. Mayer's wife said, well, my favorite actress is Barbara Lamarr. Let's call her Lamarr. And if you break that apart, Lamarr means the sea. And they were traveling on the ocean. So the name stuck, and she became Hedy Lamarr. So she got to Hollywood, and Louis B. Mayer immediately began marketing her, saying he had just acquired the most beautiful woman in the world for MGM Studios. During the course of this time, she became the model for Snow White in the Seven Dwarfs from the 1937 animated film. She was the physical model for Snow White. She was also the model for Catwoman, who appeared in Detective Comics around that time as an arch nemesis of Batman. But she wasn't getting any movies.
Why?
No jobs were there yet. And also, this is a big one, she didn't speak English. She only knew the English to accept or refuse his offers. That was about all she knew. So she was getting marketed, and MGM was gonna do something with her. They were building anticipation, but she didn't actually have any roles that really people knew, except for that it was the lady from Ecstasy. And one thing that Louis did tell her that I should have mentioned when she got hired was he said she could be hired as long as she remembered to keep her clothes on this time. Because the 1933 film was very, very controversial. But then she went to a cocktail party in Hollywood at the time, and Charles Boyer, who was one of the heartthrob actors of the day, saw her and demanded that she star across from him in a movie. And she said, I can't. I don't know English. And he said, I'll hold your hand the whole time. And so they got picked up by a director for the movie Algiers, which is about a diamond thief played by Boyer, who tries to steal diamonds from this woman who has a lot of diamonds on her, played by Lamarr. And then he finds out that she is also a diamond thief, and that's how she got all of her diamonds, was by stealing them. And it's a romance between these two. It's like a romance crime thriller between these two diamond thieves who are cat and mousing each other to a certain extent. And it's said that when the movie came out in 1938, that when her face first appeared on screen, people would gasp. They were so amazed by how beautiful she was. And she went into instant superstardom. She met Pablo Picasso, Orson Welles, Charlie Chaplin. She was getting movie invites. Her next two movies were somewhat flops because they had directors switch in the middle and weren't super successful. But then her next movie, she starred across from Clark Gable of Gone with the Wind fame. One of the most heartthrob male actors of the era. And so, she was the most popular actress in the world for a time. But 1940, there was something happening on the other side of the world. A big war. Like really big. Like the biggest war. So while she was in Hollywood, Lamarr was introduced to a lot of quirky characters, such as the businessman and pilot and super wealthy, influential fellow Howard Hughes. Lamarr dated Hughes, but she was more interested in his desire for innovation than she was in him, which became a thing for most of her relationships. I'll go through some of the details of, not many details of some of them because they're not that long, but she did get married 6 times. And divorced pretty quick after on all of them. 5 if you don't count the first one. But her problem was she would get interested in something more than the actual person, and then when that thing ran its course, the marriages would dissolve. She would later write about it that she needed to stop going for people who were inferior to her. So she dated Hughes, but her scientific mind was constantly bottled up in Hollywood because the main job she would get in all of these films was not as an elite emotional conveying actress, but usually as an actress who had a few very punchy lines written, and mostly it was her accent and looks were what was supposed to be the main steal of the show. She would play mixed race people. She would play people from all over because she was just an exotic looking, accented femme fatale in some films. And it was said that every woman wanted to be her and every man wanted to date her. But Howard Hughes, who she was dating at this time, ended up giving a set of equipment to her to use in her trailer on set. And so she had an inventing table set up in her house.
A set of what kind of equipment?
Electrical and just general tools, constructing things. It's nothing. There's nothing specific that we know, but there is one thing we know she designed for him, because Howard Hughes was a famous pilot. So he took her to his airplane factories. He was also very rich. He took her to his airplane factories and showed her how the planes were built and introduced her to a lot of the scientists that worked on the planes. And she was inspired to help him with his quest to make faster planes for the U.S. military. So she bought a book about fish and a book about birds and combined the fin design and wing designs on the fastest types of fish and birds and redesigned wings for planes. And upon showing the design book to Howard Hughes, he told her that she was a genius. So she was indeed a genius. She also improved the stoplight and created a tablet that could be dissolved in water to make Coca-Cola or something similar.
How did she improve the stoplight?
I have no idea. I have no idea. There was one particular innovation that she does that's a lot more important than all of these. And that one is what I focused on. But that is a good question. I should check that out. Yeah, I mean, stoplights, they're very effective now. And it's easy to imagine them not being, though.
Yeah, but like, it's
To
the same.
make them faster.
Timing, something, I'm sure there's something. I'd have to check. Or even just how bright they are. You could imagine without the covers and stuff. Like
Maybe you can make a short of it later.
yeah, we'll keep posted on the YouTube channel for that. And her big innovation, we won't explain on audio too much of how the technical side of it works because that might be boring. But I think it's pretty interesting. And so if you're interested in that, check out the YouTube channel where we'll do a full breakdown on how her innovations worked. She would always say, though, improving things comes naturally to me. And this, again, calls back to her dad was immediately planting the seeds in her mind. So now we've got George Antheil stepping into the story. So he was born in 1900 in New Jersey.
There's one of her husbands.
This was not actually. Actually, they didn't even date.
Really?
Yeah, crazy. Oh yeah, for every husband there were at least 2 affairs. It was very notable Hollywood, and that because that doesn't really influence at all how scientifically brilliant she is, but it influenced the public perception of her. She was seen more as a airheaded bimbo Hollywood type personality, and so some of her innovations later were kind of rejected because of who she was and not whether the ideas themselves were very good. And obviously that doesn't speak at all about your scientific ability, but it influenced the public perception of her. But George Antheil was an American composer, pianist, provocateur, and called himself in his autobiography the bad boy of music. He would make aggressively modern mechanical soundtracks for things. He would use airplane engines and flapping bird wings that he would record in his music. He was hyper modern, obsessed with changing how music was perceived. He thought of music as needing to be, and this is important, systems, timing, and coordination more than emotion. He didn't want to feel music. He wanted it to impact you through. He thought you could essentially chart and force music to impact a certain way, and as a composer approach it scientifically rather than emotionally. Now, whether that's true or not, probably musicians have their own opinions on.
Have you listened to any of the stuff he made?
I actually listened to like probably 6 or 7 or 8 hours maybe of his stuff while writing this episode. It was pretty good stuff. It's not that modern sounding. No. It's from the 1920s, so it's pretty old stuff. But he was obsessed with machine music, like player pianos, punch roll synchronization, because that is, very mechanical and not emotionally driven music, even though the songs it plays are the same as a pianist might play. And he lived all over in Paris, Berlin. And so he had an outsider status for a lot of American minds and intellectuals at the time because he had been in Berlin. Yeah. But in 1940, Lamarr met him at a dinner party. He was another one of the quirky people in her life that seemed to pop up throughout her entire story. He shared a similar invention-minded interest as her, but they talked about a lot of topics, and their big one was the looming war, because the U.S. didn't enter the war till 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Shockingly, the U.S. actually entered the war several days after Canada did. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Canada responded to the Pearl Harbor bombing faster than the U.S. did to declare war. That's just a fun little tidbit.
Why?
Because they really wanted to get into the war. Actually, also, Canada just wanted to show they weren't Great Britain. Yeah. And so, even though they were, tangent then. Great Britain was in charge of Canada still. But Canada had its own separate system, and Great Britain's heavy influence on their international holdings had started to slip away. And so to some extent, the Canadian government, similar to how the US did a couple hundred plus years before, was saying you shouldn't be able to declare war without our consent. It's similar to the taxes problem the US had earlier. The only problem was everyone in Canada also thought we should probably fight the Nazis. So when Britain declared war, they just decided to wait a little bit before declaring, just so that they would declare at a different time than Britain, so that they would show symbolically that they were not that they could choose to declare war if they wanted. And Great Britain didn't care that much because they had bigger problems like the Nazis to deal with, dropping 2 million tons of bombs in, a year.
So the Canadians had a different military and everything than Great Britain did.
Technically. Actually, a cool thing the Canadians...
Was their military controlled by Great Britain?
They were under the rule of the British Empire. But a cool thing that the Canadians did during this time was stole a lot of planes from the US. And the US wanted them to. So this was before the days of satellite and GPS.
So what, they were stealing them and sending them
to
the war, but US wasn't actually giving planes, but they were having them stolen from them.
Yeah, so we weren't allowed to send war materials because we had signed a non-entering a war agreement with the precursor to the United Nations, the League of Nations. But we really wanted to send planes to Great Britain because we didn't want the Nazis to win. Yeah. And a lot of sentiment was pushed against it. Even Disney was pushing sentiment against it. They had Donald Duck have a Hitler mustache, and it was called in a De Fuhrer's face was their like they made an animated film making fun of Hitler, which made him decree that there was like a standing death order on Donald Duck or something. Also, Charlie Chaplin, Hitler was a big fan. He had the mustache first. And so this is a lot. Yeah. But anyway, we weren't allowed to send planes over. So we decided to start flying planes into the border. And because there was no satellite or GPS, the border was very badly defined. Yeah. And so they would fly them right to where the border was. And then the pilots would go and like sit in a cabin or something that conveniently had windows not facing where they parked their plane. And then the Canadians would be like, oh my gosh, who left this plane here? Oh, sorry. And then they'd hop in the plane and fly it and say that they thought it was on Canadian soil. And so it belonged to them. And they'd ship them over to assist Great Britain in the war effort. And that's how we transported planes there, because we would be like, oh, dang it, our planes just keep going missing. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, that was going on at the time. So we hadn't yet declared war. This was 1940 when they met. But war was obviously looming. The U.S. was doing things like shipping planes out, which she might have heard from Howard Hughes, who she had been dating around this time. Though she was married around this time as well. But she was dating Hughes. It's complicated with her relationships. But they were sitting there, and Antheil later recalled that Hedy said that she did not feel very comfortable sitting there in Hollywood and making lots of money when things were in such a state. So they discussed the war effort, and lo and behold, Antheil, who understands a lot of these mechanical systems for timing and stuff, Hedy had happened to have sat in on meetings about munitions, weaponry, and what their problems were. So Lamarr and Antheil began to tinker with ideas to combat the Axis powers for when the U.S. inevitably entered the war in the following year.
So did she know English now?
Oh, yeah. But at this point, she had been in the U.S.
I figured, but I was like, wait, that doesn't make much sense if she didn't.
Yeah, no, she's been learning. Though, because Antheil lived in Berlin, I'm sure they probably spent time speaking. I mean, they both spoke French as well. Antheil lived in Paris for a while. Hedy was fluent in French. So yeah, they probably had some very interesting, like trilingual or even more. They were both very smart people. Conversations, the same way like Spanglish sometimes gets spoken, where people just mix it back and forth, and it's very hard to follow if you don't follow that naturally. So frequency hopping was needed. I'll explain a little bit about what that is. So one of the most serious problems that was happening in modern warfare was radio communication, jamming and interception. So you could block signals because they're sending out radio frequencies at a set frequency, or you could just steal them and listen in. So during World War II, radio-controlled weapons, especially things like torpedoes, were very, very vulnerable to this. And the reason why is the torpedoes were guided by a single radio frequency. And so the enemies could just change their dial until they find a frequency, and the frequency that the torpedo's on, and disrupt by broadcasting noise on that same frequency. Once jammed, the weapon just lost its guidance, veered off course, and became useless. In some cases, they could even hijack the signal by playing louder stuff on the same frequency over and try to take control of the... So the idea behind frequency hopping was very, very simple. Don't stay on the same frequency. The problem is, if you change frequencies, your missile no longer gets guided from you. So the idea was, instead of transmitting these signals through a fixed channel, you have to make the receiver on the missile or torpedo change signals at the same time and they're both changing to the same setting. That was really complicated in that time. It's a simple idea, but it becomes a lot more complicated to implement, especially because this is pre-computers, pre-microchips. But someone had a lot of experience thinking about timing. And the idea that they had was to install the player from a player piano inside the onboard torpedo. And the punched holes, which there are 88 possible variations on the punched holes to correspond to the 88 keys on a piano, those would signal a frequency change. And if you had a different roll of paper, every time you did that, you would have a different pattern of frequency changes, and they would be changing too fast for the enemy to keep up with them. So the signal would appear like just fragmented bursts of noise scattered across a spectrum. So they wouldn't be able to intercept communications or jam the guidance systems on these weapons. The effective jamming, you have to know when and where each frequency will occur. And so the way a player piano works, this could let you change it dozens of times every second, which becomes essentially impossible with back then technology to jam or intercept. This was technologically impractical, though, to some extent, because of the size that would have been needed. But innovation was happening very, very quickly, and you could easily imagine that if the military dedicated a lot of budget to it, this would have been very, very important. So anyway, they drew up designs to have frequency hopping for any radio communication that changed it from a static target to a moving target. And instead of defending a single channel, the system would spread all the information across many, many frequencies and increase its resilience against interference. So they filed a patent for that in 1941, and the U.S. military, especially the Navy, received the invention with a mix of skepticism and quiet dismissal. On paper, the idea was flawless. Like, it was a real and pressing problem. In practice, however, the inventors themselves were not exactly the type of people that the U.S. Navy was interested in hearing a lot from. Because it was, they essentially received a music proposal from a guy who travels the world and makes music using airplane engines and calls himself the bad boy of music, which just destroys your credibility. And an actress who's from a former Nazi country, who his notable affairs and is tracked across with all the different stars in Hollywood, is seen photographed in all the different clubs and parties, and they receive a patent that says this will help the war effort. Cool. So neither of them had credentials in engineering either, because they were both self-educated engineers. Technically, also, the Navy found... What's up, buddy? Well, beyond the technical concerns, though, the technical concerns that were there included the mechanical problem, which is the player piano roll idea, the synchronized mechanisms that coordinate the frequency changes between the transmitter and the receiver, would have had to survive inside the conditions of a torpedo, which is vibrating and has a lot of pressure because it's underwater, and salt water that might leak through. So even though the core concept was there, they were worried about how quickly they'd be able to properly design and implement these plans into the rapidly evolving role of the U.S. in the war. And beyond those concerns, there was a lot of misreading of Lamarr's role. And instead of being encouraged for her to refine the designs and come up with better ways of implementing them, she was constantly folded in and told that she should do a more conventional method of helping the Allies, which is war bonds. So they told her to leverage your beauty and your fame. We don't really care about your brain, which is, again, something that happened quite a bit through her life at this point. So as a result, the patent was classified, but it was shelved and nothing really happened with it. No serious development program. Neither Lamarr or Antheil were invited to further collaborate or refine it. And the irony was that the Navy agreed that it fixed their problem, but didn't like the way it did it, so they didn't bother trying to work with the idea. And that problem persisted for the rest of the war. They never really figured out the frequency changing.
They never did anything with it?
Not in World War II. To be fair, though, by the time this was patented, there was only 4 years left, so they didn't have a ton of time. But so she wanted to join the National Inventors Council, but was told by the National Inventors Council member Charles Kettering and others that she would help the war effort better by not doing that. They told her she should sell war bonds. So she participated in a war bond selling campaign. And for those who don't know, war bonds were essentially just collect money to help the war effort from people. They would try to get people to pledge percentages of their paycheck. They would try to gather money through celebrities asking for it. And she was one of, if not the most successful war bond campaigner in the war. There was a sailor named Eddie Rhodes that she would travel with, and he would sit in the crowd at each of her appearances before, hundreds of adoring fans. And then she would call him up on stage. They'd have a flirtatious conversation, and she would ask the audience if she should give him a kiss. The crowd would scream their approval, and she would say she would if enough people bought war bonds. After they sold enough war bonds, she would kiss him. He would head back into the crowd, and then they would go together to the next war bond sale. At one point, she raised $7 million in a single night in Newark, New Jersey, by promising kisses to anyone who paid over a certain amount. And in the course of her efforts raising war bonds, she raised $25 million in total. That's $300 million today, which is so much. But post World War II, public interest in the war bond work started to fade. Her technical ideas, everyone thought there would never be a war after World War II. So the technical ideas became less and less important, less and less on the mind of the U.S. military apparatus. She wound up leaving MGM in 1945 when her contract expired. Some of her more independently conducted movies really struggled to make money. They started to go way over budget. She wound up having to travel to Italy to make movies, which that happened a lot for older American stars post World War II, especially in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. That is why in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, his fictional character Rick Dalton, who was a former cowboy movie star in the 50s, in the 60s starts making spaghetti westerns at the end of the 60s in Italy, because foreign countries still found the American stars fascinating, but the American audiences moved on. They wanted to see fresh faces. They didn't want to see older people. Yeah. They didn't want to be reminded of the pre-war time with all the tensions. They wanted to collectively move on. The studio system weakened. Her box office appeal began to diminish. She had very poor investments that wound up eroding her wealth that she had made from all her earlier movies. And her frequency hopping patent expired without her making a single cent off of it. And she never renewed the patent. So yeah, she had 6 marriages. Her second marriage, which was in 1939, was to Gene Markey, who was a screenwriter and producer. It ended quickly. She then got married for a third time in 1943 to John Loder. So this was still during the war. These were the other ones. This was the 2 children she had were with John Loder. They started having financial pressures and divorced in 1947. Her fourth marriage was in 1951 to Ernest Ted Stauffer, a Swiss nightclub owner. That one was really short and had a lot of arguments over money, and it ended within a year. So that one was a very short marriage. Her fifth marriage was in 1953 to Howard Lee, a Texas oilman. That one was mostly for the money. It was to provide financial security and a retreat from Hollywood, but Lee began to discourage any professional ambition, similar to her first husband, Fritz. So that one ended in divorce in 1960. Unfortunately for her, though, the divorce in 1960 was after her last movie that she really appeared in. That's what the poster I have here is, The Female Animal in 1958, which tragically and somewhat ironically, she played an actress who was fading from public interest and dealing with the realities of getting older, not being the most recognizable face in the industry, struggling with making more money. And that's the character she portrayed in the film. And it was her last major U.S. blockbuster. And then her sixth and final marriage was in 1963 to Louis Boyce, a lawyer. By that point, her fame was kind of gone, and the marriage was very short-lived, and she divorced him in 1965 and never married again. So she faced public ridicule quite a bit too as this time went on. She was constantly being portrayed in media as being more of an eccentric than talented as an actress, and some of this was hurt by the fact that most of her roles relied on more of a physical style of just look at this pretty person. And she does have some legendary lines, but not a lot of long accolade filled roles. Like, she wasn't doing Oscar bait movies, though she did win many awards for acting when she was acting. And then because of the pressure to try to maintain her appearance, she began having plastic surgery, which was not very well done in the 60s. And so the cosmetic procedures that went badly damaged her appearance and her confidence, and she withdrew from public life, eventually isolating herself entirely, moving off of public appearances. Her last major credit in films, like I said, was in 1958. And she began to have open frustration that she never received awards or praise for any of her inventions, and that she was only seen for her face and not for her brain. And it was kind of also sad because just the time she was at, a lot of the modern, because her invention is incredibly important to our lives. She died before ever getting the chance to see the major innovations, but luckily, she did get to see enough to know that her idea did become implemented into modern technology more. Also, just with the spiral of her life, she was even arrested for shoplifting in 1991 for stealing $27 worth of items and had to plead guilty to avoid any penalties, and then pledged to not commit any more crimes. But there was a reemergence of her technological legacy, and it came very, very slowly, and at first pretty much invisible, much how her original work had been treated. But in the decades following World War II, advances in electronics made the 1941 patent not only practical, but entirely indispensable, because we no longer needed bulky player piano style rolling systems, because modern electronics began to get smaller and smaller, and communication systems became more and more complex. Electronic warfare became more important, and engineers had to start adopting spread spectrum techniques, which is the more modern equivalent of the frequency hopping that she had developed to prevent the jamming and interception of their signals. Although those systems no longer had to have mechanical synchronization, the core principle behind them, which was rapidly shifting frequencies in a coordinated pattern between the receiver and the transmitter, was unmistakably the idea from her and George's patent, which was done decades and decades earlier. By the mid-1960s, versions of frequency hopping were being used in all secure military communications, and by the late 20th century, like the 1990s, advances in civilian technologies such as satellite communication, GPS, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi all use this. Lamarr herself, though, this resurgence came with very little comfort. By the 70s and 80s, she was hiding out from the public eye, withdrawn from Hollywood, very ambivalent about her fame. She followed a lot of the technological developments from a distance. She would express frustration that an idea she had given to the U.S. Navy had essentially gone unrecognized. Some of her friends, her kids, recalled her as being sharp, opinionated, and very aware of the irony that her most lasting contribution would have nothing to do with her film career. But also would be something she probably would never get famous for. And she never got profit out of it because her patent had passed. Her later years, she began to have declining health, and also the stubborn pride in having understood that this was more important than anyone else knew ahead of time. And so formal recognition finally came near the end of her life in 1997, which is more than half a century, 50 plus years after she filed her patent. She received the Electronic Frontier Foundation Pioneer Award, honoring her contribution to the development of secure communications. By that point, she was living entirely in seclusion and did not attend the ceremony in person, which is why I spent like 15 minutes trying to find a picture of her attending the ceremony. That's why there are no pictures of her attending the ceremony. So, yeah, that's embarrassing. So yeah.
Wait, so you wrote that and then
I wrote that after. That's what I found out. I had wrote most of the scene that she received that award, and I just assumed it had to have actually been like handed to her. So I was trying to find a picture of it. And then I was like, why are there no pictures of this ceremony? And it was like, because she didn't attend. And I was like, oh, that probably should have came up into my head a little quicker as a possibility. The previous page was just talking about how she lived in isolation at the end of her life completely. And I was just like, in 1997, she just popped out to an award ceremony. So yeah, didn't attend the ceremony in person, but acknowledged the honor and expressed satisfaction that her work was finally being taken seriously. And that same year, 1997, she and Antheil were recognized by professional engineering and scientific communities. So her legacy, well, Hedy died on January 19th, 2000 in Castleberry, Florida at the age of 85. By the time of her death, she'd been living in seclusion for many, many years, completely withdrawn from public life. She had one of the most recognizable faces in the world for several years in a row, and spent her final years with almost nobody seeing her face at all, communicating only by telephone and keeping her distance from any industry. Her health declined. She was aware that her technological work was finally being acknowledged, but she didn't get to see all of the modern, everyday uses of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Her death passed with modest attention compared to the scale of how famous she used to be. What's up, buddy? Historians, technologists, and journalists increasingly returned to her patent with Antheil, recognizing it not as a novelty or curiosity, but as the genuine precursor to modern spread-spectrum communication. Wi-Fi, GPS, Bluetooth, secure military communications, the significance of her contribution became impossible to ignore. What had once been dismissed as impractical or eccentric was now understood as foundational. Her posthumous honors began to follow. She was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 2014, and also George Antheil was inducted. So they were placed alongside engineers and scientists whose work has shaped the modern world. Educational institutions began to use her story as a case study in interdisciplinary innovation, showcasing the work in art and music, collaborating with science to produce new innovations. And in Austria and Germany, she was celebrated not only as a film star, but as an intellectual figure whose talents had been underestimated by her era. So she now has an award named after her, the Hedy Lamarr Award, which was first granted in 2017 and is granted every year since. So in death, she has finally achieved what she missed out on in life, which is not just admiration for her beauty, but understanding of the brilliance she brought to innovation. And that's the end of that episode. So if you enjoyed this, please leave a rating or a review. Feel free to comment, especially if you have an idea for an episode. And check us out on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, Amazon, anywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you. And sorry about Moses, but he's been sitting so quietly. Yo, Big Mo. What's up, buddy? Why were you so loud? Oh my gosh, you got breath, bro.